Hello, everyone. Welcome to Magic in the Mundane, how wholesome narratives allow us to reimagine this world, our world. I'm super excited for this panel today, and thanks to LudoNarraCon for allowing us to have this conversation. My name is Jenny Wyndham, and I am the moderator for today. And in this panel, we will delve into how wholesome and cozy games are going to let us provide fresh perspectives on places, objects, and tales we're familiar with. Fortunately, I am joined by a panel of experts in this, folks who have cultivated narratives that create curiosity, allow players to appreciate and re-examine things that they already know with fresh eyes, and have a framework to embrace wonder and awe. So let's start with Ren, and we'll just go around and everyone introduce yourself, maybe your role and a game that you created or shared a part in creating that helps sort of represent this idea and what you may be sharing today.
Hi, I'm Ren Breyer. I'm the creative director of Unpacking. I did a lot of different roles on the project, but mainly art, narrative, and level design.
Awesome. David.
Hi everyone, I'm David. I'm the designer of Tiny Bookshop, a little game about running a bookshop by the sea. It's not out yet, it's upcoming, but I'm really excited to be here and chat with you all.
Yeah, Marina.
Hello everyone, I'm so happy to be here. Thanks for having me. I'm Marina Diaz. I'm the principal game designer of a game that is not out yet either, that is called The Berlin Apartment for a company in Germany called Games. And in the past, I was also the lead game designer of Dordogne, a game that was released in the last year in consoles.
Hey, I'm Kyle McKernan. I am a game director and designer at Co-op, and I was the co-director and lead designer on Goodbye Volcano High.
Awesome. Yeah, thank you so much, everyone. And again, I'm Jenny Wyndham. I'm one of the organizers of Wholesome Games, and I'm really happy to facilitate this conversation. So what I think is really interesting, and a phrase that I find I gravitate towards, is this idea of magic in the mundane. I was really curious, and just to kick us off, wondering what that phrase means to you, or when you saw really that phrase, what you thought of, and one of your initial gut reactions to that. And we'll kick it off. We'll go in reverse order, I guess this time. We'll start with Kyle, if that's all right.
Oh my God, hot seat.
Yeah.
Yeah, I guess what I think of when I hear that is kind of creating a story that surprises and delights while being kind of grounded in your experiences. I think for our game, it was like really specifically that we were drawing from our own experiences and then seeing how that relates to the other people that played it. That's where that like magic happened, for them. And they were like, oh, that's me, that to me is the magic in it, and just like letting people have different angles on stuff like that.
Yeah, Marina.
Yeah, for me actually it's one of my favorite topics. I really love working around magic in the mundane. For me it's basically to look for the amazing things in little everyday actions, right? Or things that sometimes we don't really realize how magical they are. Like for example, spending the summer with your grandma, like it was the case of Dordogne, or like the game I'm currently working on, just like being, like having really nice times, just spending time in your apartment, or doing things like cooking or making a tea. For me has a lot of emotional baggage, and I think it's an amazing tool for also create relatability in different media. So that's
David.
what comes to my mind.
For me, it's almost like a daydream-like quality, like that feeling of this is what life could be, and this is the beauty in that. So with Tiny Bookshop, we're trying to do like it's like a tiny utopia in a way. Like it's not a grand scale. It's not like a big plan for society. It's just like a tiny daydream for yourself that makes reality kind of nice and magical and feel good.
That's really lovely. And Ren.
For me, it's about noticing what's special in our everyday lives. like with a game like Unpacking, people think, wow, that's like really boring. Why would you want to make a game about unpacking? Was like a question we got really early on in development. And it's like, well, maybe you haven't thought hard enough about unpacking and what it means and what is interesting about it. And I think that's the magic in the mundane.
Yeah, I agree. I think what all of you have encompassed with these ideas of delight and sort of seeing what's special and what we sort of habitually engage with or sort of regularly engage with is finding what makes it magical and why we should celebrate some of the things that make up our daily lives. I'm really curious then, how do we keep the familiar engaging? If it's something that we have done time and time again, something we've encountered many times over, what are the ways that we can keep it exciting or interesting for players once they start to play a game about or including these mundane activities? And just to mix it up, we'll start with David.
Yeah, for me, it's about like the ritual of labor, sort of like we have a lot of repetitive labor in Tiny Bookshop. You're running a bookshop after all, and we wanted to make that feel as rewarding and like as flow state inducing or a ritual as possible. That like in fast moving games you'd use the term juice to like how describe how you like modify mechanics so they feel more rewarding. And we add juice, if you will, through narrative means and like add payoff to your actions through emotionally meaningful moments in the game that come from these rituals of labor, of these mundane rituals in a way.
Yeah, and when I think of juice, especially like unpacking really comes to mind, I think in both the audio and tactile feel of placing items. Ren, did you want to add anything there?
Um, hmm. I'm so sorry. I zoned out a little. Is there any chance you could repeat the question? I
Yeah, no worries. Just how you keep the familiar engaging for players.
Oh, yeah. Okay, so for me, there's a bit of like removing friction, removing the things that people don't want to engage with in the familiar that maybe distract from what I think is good about it. So, like in unpacking, we removed having to lift things, right? Like just by the nature of it being a game, you don't have to hurt your back doing it. The boxes disappear after you finish unpacking them, like just on their own. Things like that, just low friction, and make the things like David said, things that feel good, emphasize why they feel good, make them feel even better.
Yeah, almost going back to that ideal dreamlike quality of the best possible version of what these more mundane tasks could be.
Yeah, exactly.
Kyle, I guess what else would you add to in terms of keeping the familiar engaging, especially as you mentioned personal experiences with Goodbye Volcano High?
Yeah. I mean, for us, it's kind of a weird situation because we actually ended up in almost the opposite space from removing friction and stuff because most of our game is through dialogue and making choices in dialogue. And one of the early things that we really wanted to do was design the UI so it's representative of our main character's thoughts and feelings. So they'll sometimes fight back against like an intrusive thought you're making them have, kind of thing. Um, and I think like that's really where the engagement, at least for me, happens is that I'm playing as a character who has their own feelings and thoughts, not as myself, you know, and like their life story is familiar to me because it all makes sense in the context of my world, but I'm kind of having a conversation with them through the gameplay, which is kind of fun for me.
I love that. And with Dordogne Marina, I think this idea of emotional sort of nostalgia and that emotional engagement is also really strong. So if you wanted to add how you keep the familiar engaging with that or your current project.
Actually, basically, in Dordogne, it was kind of one of the first kind of big projects where I could test my theories about emotional game design, which is my expertise, right? What I like doing. And for me, it was very important not only to think about my own experiences, and which I totally brought to the game. Like, for example, there is a team mini game in Dordogne that it was part of kind of my creative process. When I need to think, I make myself a tea, and I wanted to have that for the player, right? But I also try to think about other players that might not have the same experiences as I do, right? Kind of like in a mission for making games for everyone, right? Like not everyone who's gonna be playing my games necessarily had my same background or like circumstances, and it's really hard. But for example, an exercise that I do is to talk with many different people. I listen a lot to stories and that they tell me, and that's my way of kind of trying to bring more relatability and human connection into my games, basically going outside, speaking to people, gathering stories, and like being able to get a better idea in my head for telling better stories in some way.
Yeah, I love this idea of even if maybe someone hasn't had the same experiences as you, still trying to find ways to show them that, again, how relatable a lot of this is and how accessible a lot of it can be. When you're designing for or writing for a game that is meant to feel really slice of life or focused on the sort of rote details that we engage with, what are some of the elements that you hone in on to keep, some elements that you are trying to avoid, and some details that you like to lean into? And I think, Ren, maybe kick us off because you touched on this a little bit with your idea of friction and removing that friction.
I'm not entirely sure I understood the question.
I guess, are there any details that you chose to, like with the boxes and making sure they disappeared after they were unpacked? Were there other details that you decided to add to lessen friction, or any details you decided to really lean into to enhance that feeling of packing or unpacking?
Okay. I guess, well, there were some things we considered at one point that we left out. Like really early on, we talked about what if when you took an item out, it was like wrapped in paper, and then you'd like click again and again for the paper to fall off, and it'd end up on the floor, and you like remove the paper from the floor by clicking it. So I know we were just like, this is getting just like too tapping all over the place. This was like really early ideation. It's not something we ever implemented. But there were like all kinds of things we considered that were like, yeah, this really plays into the idea of unpacking things. You could open your boxes with like a box cutter, so your cursor could transform. All kinds of ideas like that. That we were like, yeah, this is fun and this is unpacking like, but we were also like, is this really necessary? Does this complicate things too much? Is this not even fun? So it was always this balance between keeping things smooth and simple and leaning into the fantasy of like, this is the thing you're doing, and these are the things that are kind of memorable about doing it, or like the things that you think about when you think about unpacking.
Yeah, I love that. The idea of remembering you have to find the fun. Players should want to engage with this, even though typically in real life, that's something that probably doesn't sound the most appealing, spending a couple hours unpacking. Marina, I'm curious, what are some of the ways that you honed in on some of these details or found any details you're like, nope, let's leave these behind because they don't achieve the goal that we're hoping for?
Actually, for example, in kind of games, like, I mean, I've been so lucky that I worked on, for my last two projects, narrative kind of mainly games, right, which I love. But also in these kind of games, especially if they are set in houses and stuff like that, you need to be very careful to not be all the time giving chores to the players. Like, it's very easy to, for example, ask them to clean or like, I don't know, to organize, right? And I'm thinking now of Gwen that she's kind of nodding. And of course, like anything that is house related is complicated to bring to gameplay because I mean, we all hate cleaning and stuff, right? So you need to kind of find your tricks and add to the gameplay something that the players can find extra rewarding for these little chores. It comes to my mind as well as examples like Animal Crossing, right? Like, in real life ever you would like to just clean your house or even kill cockroaches, but Animal Crossing, and I think like the gameplay setting makes it so much fun that players don't mind. And like you can always add elements, like of course not only from the game design side, which is my expertise, but working with the other colleagues from other departments like audio, how we can make visually more beautiful, so players don't say, I'm cleaning again, or like, I don't like cleaning my teeth after making it, or whatever, right? So basically I would say that in my case, I try to besides making the gameplay more fun, to also collaborate with other people that can bring cool ideas into the table to, not bore the players.
Yeah, I think it's really important to make sure that it's like a multifaceted approach for sure. David, with Tiny Bookshop or Tiny Bookstore, I'm curious what you also try to highlight, especially maybe as not everyone has run a bookshop and maybe don't have the idea of like those details or aren't familiar with the details that they may encounter.
Yeah, for me, it's this fantasy of running a bookshop, right? It's not the nitty-gritty of organizing the ISBN numbers and figuring out what to order. It's about taking this humble fantasy of like a very small shop and a very personal experience working with the people, and it's a second-hand bookshop on wheels, so it's very limited and humble in that way. And for me, the biggest design, I don't know, it's not a struggle, it's a dialectic sort of. It's like a for and against always when designing this game. So it's a shop game, but it's a humble shop game, or like I'm trying to make it not about money, if that makes sense. But it's a shop game, so the way we try to do this is, of course, by shifting the focus always away from money and turning it into like a tidal resource, or like something you have to spend. Like you get money, you spend money, and then you do other things with things you do, right? So it turns from a sort of shop game into a game where you meet people, foster relationships, and become part of a community that you engage with. And that's, I hope, where the players will measure their progress in the game and take their sense of satisfaction from. And the money counter will be like a clock on the wall. It's something that I have sometimes more time and sometimes less time, but it's not something I'm obsessed with like in other tycoon type games, if that makes sense. So that's a very big
Yeah.
focal point.
Yeah, I like this idea of moving while you're doing very rote tasks that could be, for lack of a better phrase, like min-maxed to a certain extent. There's a focus more on that emotional resonance. Kyle, just to add that question to you as well, I think especially because Goodbye Volcano High leans into that emotional resonance.
Yeah.
What are some ways that you've designed and you wanted to like lean into certain details or maybe avoid certain details, especially when dealing with that more personal narrative?
Yeah, I mean, I think for us, the sort of slice of lifeiness exists in tandem with the greater conflict in our game, which is the impending end of the world, which, isn't such a slice of lifey concept, but I think giving quiet moments between the characters and it's so focused on this ensemble of friends um, to the player makes that conflict feel worse or more impending or more scary in a way. You kind of feel like you're there hanging out with them. And then as the game goes on and gets closer to that catastrophe, those slice of life moments, like they're really quiet, like you're just goofing off with your friends, becomes more meaningful as you face mortality. Which like this is like not the coziest angle on this, but it is kind of like just how we thought of it. I think we really focused on those moments between the characters so that when it comes to thinking about that conflict, the player is like, oh, okay, like this feels real to me.
Well, I think you touch on a really important point that I think that we sometimes forget when we talk about coziness or sort of this dynamic of slice of life. And that means slice of life doesn't mean devoid of conflict. And I guess an apocalypse is definitely like probably a very big
It's a
conflict
big
to
one, yeah.
encounter. I'm curious, what are some of the ways then that you introduce this conflict but allowed it to feel still approachable and accessible to players who are looking for an experience that is a bit more sort of slice of life or cozy or tonally, I guess, like quiet. And I guess
Yeah.
Kyle, yeah, we'll kick it off with you.
Yeah. I think that it's tough because there's a lot of people who I think don't want to engage with that, and find it a little bit too emotionally. It's like a little bit too real, and that's something that we had to think about when we were designing it. But we wanted to introduce it in a way that also feels very realistic and is kind of approachable. The characters don't really take it seriously at first, which to me felt the most realistic thing. Like they're just kind of memeing it online at the time. And then as it becomes more real, then it becomes this kind of big emotional conflict. But I think it worked twofold, that it feels realistic and it also just kind of eases the player into it, which I think is how these things happen in real life, in a lot of senses, right? You just one day you're sitting there chatting with your friends, and then the next day you're like, oh my God, what is going on? So, yeah, I mean, I think doing all the slice of life stuff with the conflict was like the big thing for us.
Yeah, David, I'm curious as well, when running into creating a tiny bookshop and tiny bookstore, is there any conflict that you've introduced? And so, what are the ways that you've gotten players to engage with that conflict?
So the core conflict is, of course, having enough money to do things. But the secondary conflict that is very small, we've toned it down a lot, because it's supposed to feel welcoming. But Tiny Bookshop takes place in a small rural coastal town. So there's, of course, a lot of expectations and thoughts that come to that fantasy of a coastal town. A lot of them are positive, it's picturesque, but also there are some ways a coastal town can have some things that will conflict with a little bookshop on wheels, like very rule-stickly citizens that might complain if you set up shop in the park. So that will then become an arc, right? That we can engage with sort of small things that we'd like to see differently. Especially here in Germany, Germans are very sticklers for rules, so it's our way to poke back at that cultural norm a little bit and be like, hey, what if we let loose a tiny bit? So that's something we introduced. Like we take these small things, especially things that would conflict with a little bookshop on wheels, right? Like rule stickliness or people complaining that the books are too violent, and then they buy 10 crime books and they're like, hey, I love this gore, this is great. Right, so we take these and we put them on 200%, but like in a very harmless and funny way, and then we allow the players to resolve them through being themselves and being a bookshop, and then people will come around and notice, oh wow, okay, cool, there's a way to coexist or to combine and make something cool.
Yeah, I love this idea of also arcs. Like it doesn't have to be, one big thing. You can also play with having smaller sort of conflicts that arise and that sort of episodic feel almost. Ren, I'm curious about conflict in unpacking or anything else you've worked on and how you've allowed it to feel approachable to players as they encounter that conflict.
So, I mean, the biggest conflict in unpacking is the diploma moment, right? There's a few other things I can think of to answer this question, but I think the diploma thing is the big one where we wanted to. Sorry, I'm just like I have so many thoughts about this. I'm like they're competing. We wanted players to feel like stifled in that apartment, to feel like things aren't the same in this apartment as they were before. Like in some ways, in this apartment, like you can move everything. So you've got, unlike the previous apartment where you could only move your things. So it's like the game, on the one hand, telling you, oh, this is more your space than last time. But on the other hand, it's like the space itself is hostile. It specifically makes you feel like this person didn't make space for you, right? And I mean, that culminates in the diploma, but it's everything. In the terms of in terms of introducing this conflict, but still making it understandable to the player, like and making it approachable. It's like in that apartment, we made it so that you can move everything, so you can move the guy's things. You're not just trying to puzzle your things around it. But you might not know it to begin with. You don't expect that that's the case. So actually making the boyfriend stuff take up so much space that you kind of have to move his stuff, that is our way of communicating that you need to do it. Because initially, like, I arranged things a bit less hostile. It's just like, you had to fit your things around his, and you could also move his things. But because players might not know it, they were trying to just fit themselves around the boyfriend. But if they get pissed off at the boyfriend, they're like, you didn't leave any room for me, move your stuff. And then they realize that they can. They're like, oh, okay, great. So it's like giving players that extra bit of control in the place of conflict, I think, kind of helps to make it more accessible to players, or approachable.
Yeah. And I like that subtle break of what maybe they've been familiar with in the past. I think we've talked a lot about ritual and creating this sort of idea of mundanity, like in a wonderful way, and making it just a little bit different so they, even if they're not consciously aware of it, realize something is happening, I think is really cool. And Marina, I guess, what are some of the ways that you've also explored creating conflict in a more slice of life narrative?
I was thinking while the others were answering that I think for a slice of life, sometimes because conflict in life can happen suddenly or can happen gradually, right? And like gameplay wise, I don't know what is better if it depends of the story. I think in the case of the games I've been working on, for example, in the Berlin apartment, we touch really complicated things because every episode of the game is set in a different historical moment of the city of Berlin, which of course, like, it's a conflict itself. So basically, when we were working on episodes like 1933, right before the Holocaust, or like another episode that we have in 1989 with the Berlin Wall up, those topics that bring some conflict already themselves historically, right? Um, I think in this case, what we did is that, of course, some things are already implied, especially for European American players, Western players, I would say, because I wouldn't assume that everyone in Asia, for example, is super familiar, as we are also not familiar always with their conflicts, because in schools they are not taught all the time. But basically, gameplay-wise, I think we try trying to introduce things gradually, so we kind of get players familiar to what's gonna come. And sometimes even we don't tell them, right? Like for example, in the episode about 1933, sorry for the spoilers, but it's a Jew man that needs to flee his house because his environment has become completely hostile. His neighbors are harassing him low-key, right? Like trying to bring the player to slightly to what could happen to people back then when you were a Jew. And in this case, we don't tell people there is this conflict. Like basically, we just make them kind of get familiar with the character and like a bit of their character's feelings. And then slowly we introduce the different conflict situations. Like, is the neighbor is knocking the ceiling because you are too loud, but it's not true, right? They just knock because they want to be hostile. And that's the way that we start creating conflict. And then people, like, the idea was that people could made up their own story in some way, and like relate to the game without giving them every single thought, but allowing them to also get their own conclusions and thoughts, and to reflect a bit on these especially hard moments of our history. And in the case of Dordogne, for example, there is a huge, like, there is a familiar conflict going on, and we have a child in the middle, which is our protagonist, and it's it was a challenge to introduce this kind of conflict, because in some ways also the reflection of how kids in real life, people think that they don't get what's going on, but they know a lot, right? So here the idea was to basically show little portions, like little slices of this conflict going on, and then have a huge conflict at the end. So basically, we were preparing the player along the episodes until there is this huge boom in the story that happens, and that's how you get there, right? But there are so many different ways.
Yeah, and I think this idea of trusting the player to be able to put the pieces together is something that all of you touched upon in different ways, giving enough clues so that they can put it together and feel like they're also experiencing it to some degree personally as a player. David, I'm curious then, what are some of the tips that you have for other developers hoping to create and explore these type of smaller, cozier slice of life experiences that highlight this idea of the magic and the mundane?
Yeah, I'd say it's focusing on the fantasy, like the big daydream or the nice little tiny utopia, whatever you might choose. Really, really pick and choose that fantasy and then protect it. And like always, whenever you make a design decision or a writing decision, come back to that fantasy and ask yourself, okay, just because that is the genre default, is that actually a match for this fantasy? And then you can sort of evolve your design always in regards to this fantasy and come back to it. Even like, what, 2 years later in development, it's worthwhile to check back in on this fantasy and be like, okay, are we still online, on target, sort of trying to reach that?
Yeah, I love that. Kyle, I guess any tips for developers looking for this type of, to create this type of experience?
Uh, yeah, I think for our experience where it's like a primarily narrative, emotional sort of thing, you know, people say write what you know, and like I don't want that to be limiting, but more freeing in a way that put yourself in it. That's kind of what we did, and like you can't really be precious or afraid of that. And what I've seen is the moments that have resonated the most with players from our game are the ones where, you know, it's just like, what would we say in this moment? Where what are our feelings about this? And it was pretty freeing for it's like pretty scary to put something out like that, but it's pretty freeing for us to write like that. And I think that helps people see kind of that magic in their own day-to-day life and their relationships and stuff, because they're like, oh, okay, like that has meaning. That little joke I had with my friend has a lot of meaning that I hadn't thought about before. um, those connections across, designer and player are really cool, I think. So it's a good thing to lean into, kind of just like really speaking to your own experiences.
Yeah, and I imagine probably really interesting as you reflect on your own experiences and sort of discover
Oh
what
yeah.
is really meaningful to you too.
Especially when you're telling a game about the end of the world, it's like
Right.
it's like, why did I do this?
Marina, any tips for game devs hoping to create these type of games?
Actually, I think the one that Kyle just gave was really good one. I'm gonna also put emphasis on that one. I would say I would call it open your heart, but also know your limits, right? Because sometimes I found myself that for myself is really hard depending on which experience I want to tell. Like, is I really want to share it, but at the same time, it's your own private stuff, right? And that's extremely hard. And I think you need to also kind of be conscious of, do I really want to put this out there? And to take care of yourself, right? But if you're totally fine, I think it's such a precious gift that we give to players, or experiences and or feelings, that I would totally say that this is what resonates with players the most. And that's how we also create games that last forever in some way, right? Like, especially some universal experiences that we could put out there. I'm always a champion for this kind of approach to making any kind of creative thing. And then the other one is to observe. I think it's really important to observe everything you can, like even going to the street and, like looking at everything can give you lots of ideas and input for your games, emotions, and again, relatability. So I would say that those are big two big ones for me that I wish other people um, use for their games as well, I think.
Yeah, I think this definitely could work cross like any kind of creative project that you're working on, any type of genre, that power of observation. Ren, any tips for game devs?
Oh man, everyone said such good stuff. I was like thinking about the next thing I could say, and then someone would say it. And I'm like, oh no, no. I loved everything that everyone said. I would say it's related to what Marina said about observing. It's like I think there's often a tendency to like play a game and be like, I want to make a game like that game, or like this other game that I know, or maybe cross these two games that I know and make a game that's this meets that. And it's like, I think it's more interesting and you will end up with something more unique if you try to look for inspiration outside of games, and especially if you're going for a magic in the mundane kind of game, is like look at your life, look at the lives of people around you, try to find what's special about those experiences, what do you like about them, what do you don't like about them, and just kind of try to come at things from a different angle.
Oh, forgot to mute myself. Unmute myself. Yeah, I think this idea of just like finding a different angle is really exciting because again, that's part of that joy of seeing what you've done or what you encounter all the time, just new. We're getting close to the end of our time together, so just a couple more questions. Kyle, I'm curious why you would consider it important to write these kind of stories that aren't grand epics necessarily or high, fast-paced action, but are perhaps more understated.
Yeah. Sorry, my cat is like staring me down and starting to meow. So, um, I think, hmm, I think the quiet parts and the like sort of intimate stories are where the most universal and interesting human experiences are, honestly, for me. And our game is like 90% those like just like quiet conversations with people. And I think that's where a character gets a lot of their stuff when you're seeing a story play out because, this character, it feels weird that this character would be, going deep diving into their queerness at the end of the world, you know, giving a speech on TV or something like that, like something big and boisterous. It feels so much more intimate to the player to be like sitting with them quietly talking, like the best conversations you ever have are the ones that like go till 4 in the morning with one random person and then you're connecting with that person. And that's kind of the vibe that we wanted to bring to GVH. I don't know. I think for me, it's where emotional connection from player to character happens, you know?
Yeah, definitely. Ren, I'm curious why is it important to you to write and explore these kind of stories?
Yeah, I do think they tend to be more personal. I think when you turn down the volume on everything else, like, so for example, like with a game like Unpacking, we turn down the volume by having just this one simple mechanic, having almost no text, and all that. Like, you turn down the volume on all these things, and the player really has to work a little harder, has to pay attention, and then they notice things that they otherwise wouldn't have noticed. So, for example, if we had the names of the items written on the screen, like you pick up an item and it tells you what it is, the player would not bother to look at the item. The item may as well be just a blank square with the name, because that's as much attention as a lot of players would give it. Whereas because there's no name, the player has to like pick up the item, look at it, maybe turn it around, be like, oh, okay, I know what this is. Like, they have to think about it. And so I think when you kind of turn down the volume, when you don't like give the game a lot, like when you don't give the player a lot of information, or have literally like the volume up, like someone is talking, narrating, Players, I think, pay more attention. You shouldn't underestimate your players as well. Like, you should know that, like, you should make sure that you do everything you can to get them to pay attention where they should. But like, count on them to be smart enough to be able to do that. I don't know if that entirely answers the question, maybe veered off a little, but that's what that makes me think about, I guess.
Yeah, I think there's power, like you said, in not underestimating your players. And I think that's a really important thing to bring to development across, again, any creative project, essentially. Marina, anything that you'd like to add?
I think that it comes down to also focus, to not lose the focus of where your story is going or like your gameplay. I think it's like, for me, it's like designing a map. You need to kind of guide the player to wherever you want to guide them. And, like sometimes you decide that you're gonna be just unfocused, and that's what your game is about, right? But sometimes, if you want them, especially with, I've noticed that with heavy topics, it's much better to have simplicity and everything else, as Gwen was explaining, than loading your game with a lot of different stuff, because then that means that you are dividing the attention of your player, right? And like when we are coming to topics, like for example, when one of the very first games that I made on Bitsy was about my dad's bipolar disorder, and it's an extremely simple design game visually and like mechanically, because what I wanted the players was to kind of get more into the narrative part, which was to connect with this bipolar disorder experience. And in my mind, if I would add anything else or other mechanics that is not walking and reading or taking things, I thought that the players were not going to have the same amount of time to connect with this experience because they need to digest it properly. And I think that's, for example, one of the magics of walking simulator. Like in games like Firewatch, for example, we are touching like an extremely heavy topic, right? And you don't do 1,000 different things. I mean, you do and you don't. But at the core, very core of the mechanics, you are just doing very simple stuff that are almost repetitive mechanically. And I think that's the magic of that kind of gameplay. Like I'm doing things in a meditative way, but at the same time, I'm also hearing really heavy stuff, and that's how I would really like to design these kind of games personally.
Yeah, there is something to having that ritual and again that repetition that allows you the space to think about things, but much more in a focused manner. Yeah, David, I guess why would it be important to you to design these more understated stories?
I really liked what Maria brought up with like the simplicity and like turning down the volume sort of many things. And I have just personally in my personal life this deep longing for simplicity and like slowing down a little bit and for nature and like a more what's it called, more conscious living, sort of just like more in in line with everything. And for me, yeah, to realize that in a game is like to give players a preview of what that could be and like to put a word to that longing that I feel and I believe many people will feel and are feeling. And it's sort of paradoxical. Making a game is not really quaint and quiet and like picturesque. So the more you do that, the more you fuel that longing. So that's kind of good. Like you keep the fire alive that made you want to make the game in the first place. But yeah, it's I think this longing for more these beautiful moments in life, and the simplicity.
You are not alone in wanting that simplicity in your life. And as a player, I appreciate these kind of games that allow us to, even for a brief time, delve into that and just sort of allow ourselves to get lost in that idea of simplicity. Just to As so many of the responses have been about how personal creating these types of games are, I wanted to end with maybe a more personal question to each of you. I'd love it if you could share your favorite, if you have one that comes to mind, knowing that there's probably many favorites. A favorite detail or moment, either captured in your game or perhaps that you've experienced in another game, that really encapsulated this idea of magic in the mundane for you? And I'll start with Marina.
Actually, I think this is a very good question because for my answer, it goes very related to what we were talking about simplicity. And like, I always talk about this example because it's about the game that made me realize that I really want to make emotional games, which is, Aiko by Fumito Ueda, right? And I really like the gesture of holding hands with your character. And I think when I saw that for the first time, I think I've never seen anything like that in my life before. And I thought, like I enjoy any kind of games, but I really kind of it blew my mind when I saw this mechanic. Just like the simplicity of holding someone else's hand in a game for me was so powerful. And it was like, yes, this is what I want to do. I want to give to the players my hand and kind of make them feel less alone. And that's also part of why I'm a game developer, because I feel that we make people feel less lonely in this world, bringing our experiences and like sharing and connecting. So I would say that that's my favorite gesture ever in games. I repeat it over and over. So if there are other people watching this panel that came to my lectures, I'm going to say again, but yes.
I love that. That's one of my favorite gestures in games too. Kyle, what's one of your favorites?
Oh my God. There were so many things that like really inspired us when we were working on this. And I think one of my favorite moments from our game is we kind of do this flash forward at the start to a bonfire where all the characters are sitting around and it's clearly something is wrong. And then we tell all the rest of the story and we get there eventually and the characters have like a big conflict together and then they kind of all disperse and you get to go around and talk to each one of them based on your relationship, and that's kind of where the game kind of is leading up to. And I think those one-on-one conversations you have with those characters after spending so much time with them are the best part of the game, because at that point you're like toward the end of the game and everybody's really facing what's going to happen. And it has a lot of like, you know, I don't want to say dead air, but it has like a lot of silence and just kind of contemplating and doing that, like letting the characters contemplate it. We let the player contemplate with them. You know, it's just like, oh my God. And I think like that's a big thing for me. That was like my favorite thing to work on in the game. I spent so much time thinking about how to do that. And you know, there's so many games that have like bonfire scenes and stuff, but my friends are gonna laugh at me because Final Fantasy 15 was a huge inspiration for this, and so like I kind of like stole a little bit, not stole, took inspiration from a little bit, and was really sort of enamored with that. So
Yeah, I am a sucker for a bonfire scene, so yeah,
same.
I can say very much that I appreciate those as well. David, what about you?
It might not be a super mundane situation, but I really love like the last 30 seconds of each run in Outer Wilds. Just when the synth comes on and you know the time's up. It's like if hands down almost. And for me it's then like looking at the sun that's gonna explode and just it's almost like watching the sunrise in a game, and it's like so romantic, this liminal time in this moment that is about to end. Everything is about to end. It's just it gives me chills every time I hear that synth, and I'm teleported back to that moment of finality. Like it's finite and it's over, but it's also the sunrise somehow. I really love that.
This is my favorite game, like of all time. So you referencing that is great. That's all I have to say to that. Ren, what about you? What is a favorite moment that's been captured in games for you?
A player posted a GIF of themselves playing with the computer monitor, the tablet, and the mouse, and the keyboard, trying to make them all fit on the desk together in a good configuration that's comfortable to use. And obviously there's someone who has a tablet at home in real life, and they were like, not this fucking problem following me into video games.
Cool. All right. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Really appreciate you coming in, sharing these personal stories, sharing why this magic in the mundane is something truly special to you. Just to close out our panel, I'd love to quickly go back around, have everyone reintroduce themselves quickly and where folks can find you or anything you're working on. We'll start with Marina.
Thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful. I'm Marina Diaz. I'm the principal game designer for the Berlin apartment at BTF Games in Germany. Previously, I was the lead game designer of Dordogne, and if you want to contact me, I'm always available in my email that you can find at my website page that you can also find on my Twitter, that is ninfa_letter D, letter P. So just don't hesitate in contacting me. I always answer everyone when I have time. So yeah, thank you so much.
Awesome. David.
So, yeah, I'm David Wildemann. I'm the designer of Tiny Bookshop, and you can reach me via Tiny Bookshop. I'm not really like an online person, so yeah, go to tinybookshopgame.com, and there is an email maybe. So if you have any questions, try it via that route. It was a pleasure talking to you all.
Awesome. Thank you. Kyle?
Yeah, so I'm Kyle McKernan. I was game director and lead designer on Goodbye Volcano High at Co-op, and you can find me usually on Twitter at Space Treasured, and I'm sure my email is floating around somewhere too. But thank you so much for having me. This was a blast.
Awesome. And Ren?
My name is Ren Breyer. I'm the creative director of Unpacking. I'm currently taking a little break, but you can find more information about me on my website, renegade.info. That's renegade with a W at the start. It has links to my socials as well. Thank you.
Wonderful. And again, I'm Jenny Wyndham from Wholesome Games. You can find us on Twitter, TikTok, Instagram, and our website at wholesomegames.com. And thanks again to the folks at LudoNarraCon who helped us put this together, who facilitated this recording and presentation. And I hope you all enjoy the rest of the event. Thank you, everyone. At Wholesome Games, our goal is to brighten your day by showcasing uplifting, compassionate, and joyful games. We do this through game curation on our social channels, by producing 2 shows throughout the year, Wholesome Direct and Wholesome Snack, and through our Wholesome Presents program, where we provide marketing and financial support to select titles. Find out more about us and subscribe to our newsletter at wholesomegames.com.